Being that this course is divided into 8 weeks rather than the traditional 16-week format, we cover multiple chapters in a week. So what I've decided to do is prepare lectures that will basically be weekly lectures that will contain more than one chapter in a given lecture. This first week, we don't cover any primary readings, but next week, in the next lecture, we will talk a little bit about Epictetus at the very end of the lectures on the chapters. So this week, you'll just have chapters 1, 2, and 3, and that will help you in preparing for your quizzes that are due, and also for future exams to come. So, first of all, before I actually get into the coursework, the lecture material rather, I wanted to address the discussion that you'll do this week. This first introductory discussion is going to be the answer to a very simple question: why study the humanities? But you're going to use some different methods to answer that than you might usually use. I want you to actually go to YouTube, and I want you to do a search and say "why study the humanities?" and see what kind of results you get. You don't need to follow any kind of actual formatting per se when it comes to referencing these videos, but I do want you to put the URL and the time. If you quote somebody, say they said it at 2 minutes and 22 seconds or something like that. So that way I can go back and kind of look and see where you pulled your answers from. And you have to respond to 2 other students in order to get full credit. So also that would be helpful for you to frame your thread in such a way that it can be responded to. And when I say response, I don't mean go in and say, oh, that's really cool, that's what I was thinking. That's kind of vague. So you want to engage particular parts of somebody's thread, at least 2 other students. You can do more, but you have to do at least 2 to get full credit. This first introductory lecture is a little bit different in content because you're answering this question based on those YouTube videos, but the future lecture or future discussions that you do, you will also follow the same format. You have to respond to 2 other students. But in those lectures, those discussions rather, you'll be only dealing with the human values in these primary texts that we cover each week. Except for this week. So, no primary text this week. It's a lot to take in all at once, and so I'd rather ease into that. But this is a fast-moving course. It is an 8-week format. You signed up for it, right? So be prepared to do some reading. Be prepared to spend some time, twice the time you would spend in a normal class because of the format, right? So, but to begin with, in chapter 1, your book talks about the human experience, right? What is this human experience? What is this occurrence of the human expression, like, right? So we go all the way back to the beginning. We can't go much further than the written record. I mean, we can go just a little bit before people started writing, and we can look at cave drawings, for example. We can look at archaeological evidence and fragments of people's pottery or whatever. But the written record is where we began history. You don't have history before you have writing. You have oral tradition, right? And even much of our earliest written tradition, history, comes from oral traditions that found their way into writing. But your book looks at these cave paintings, actually, and uses those as kind of a starting point for the discussion. Of course, we move into literature and language, right, history and philosophy and so forth from this point, but your book makes some really important observations about these Paleolithic cave paintings and what they were intended to do. These cave paintings were actually considered kind of magical charms that would ensure successful hunting. They functioned as calendars for predicting seasonal migration of the animals and things like that. They could conjure up game by depicting the game. But some scholars have maybe wrongly assumed over the course of studying these caves that they may have been for commemorating the dead buried in those caves, but that is not the case. At least not in the case of the Chauvet cave. If you saw in your book, the Chauvet cave is one of the most famous prehistoric rock art sites in the world, located in southern France along the bank of the river Ardèche near Pont d'Arc. Now, this cave was discovered as recently as 1994, and this recent discoveries, they found a lot of stuff in this region, but they've found these recent discoveries have actually helped contribute to our understanding of our earliest human ancestors. So, for one thing, we could look at them and we can find an aesthetic quality to these Paleolithic cave paintings. Right, they're beautiful to look at. They're fascinating. They engage something in the authentic experience of being human. Psychologically, philosophically, we can draw on them in an aesthetic sense. And they're also very valuable because they're very old. So with one exception, all of the cave paintings have been dated between, according to scholars and archaeologists, 30,000 to 33,000 years ago. In 1998, they actually got together and had a research team, right, to go and begin to look deeper. And there's a little bit of a concern that these caves are deteriorating and we're losing, this history, this reality of who our ancient ancestors were. So there's actually some push out there to see to that they are maintained and restored and that we don't lose them. But one thing that was really interesting in the way that the Chauvet painters, they utilized their perspectival drawing. They were able to actually use these caves in a sense to convey like a three-dimensional kind of space, like a depth to the imagery. One of the famous cave paintings is called Lascaux, and it's famous. This is one of the caves in particular amongst these many different caves, but it's found in a southwestern region of France, and the exceptional quality, size, and the sophistication and the antiquity, the age of it, makes it a very important cave drawing as well, or a particular cave rather. It's estimated to be about 20,000 years old. The paintings consist primarily of large animals once native to the region, so you kind of have that depiction of game was a very important part to the people, as our most ancient Paleolithic ancestors in this sense. They moved from being hunters to farmers, and then cities and civilizations evolved from there. But this particular Lascaux cave would depict large animals that were considered native to the region at the time. Lascaux is located in the Vézère Valley, where many other decorated caves have been found since the beginning of the 20th century. Lascaux is a complex cave with several areas. There's the Hall of Bulls, the Passage Gallery, and it was discovered on September 12th, 1940, and very important cave. In 1979, several decorated caves in the same valley, in the same region, including Lascaux, were added to the UNESCO World Heritage Site because, again, part of the effort to preserve them is at stake, that we may lose them if we don't. Recently, not even too long ago, a group of about 200 archaeologists, anthropologists, and other scientists, they all got together and they actually held a symposium to discuss the plight of these priceless treasures of Lascaux. falling into disrepair, and how to preserve them for the future. So scholars and archaeologists and anthropologists are all making a very diligent effort to preserve these caves. But among the prehistoric paintings, what is distinctive about the paintings at Lascaux specifically is the bird-headed man, a bison, and a rhinoceros all in this cave. But what's so unique about this is one of the few cave paintings to depict a human of any kind. So early, it's interesting, ancient, very early human need to create an image, an artistic representation of oneself, of us, of humans. So when we study the humanities, that's the kind of thing we're really looking for. Getting into that sort of depiction of what it means to be human. And so somewhere in a cave, 30,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, a guy's drawing on the wall, showing how he sees his kind. And so, that's pretty fascinating, I think. But again, the depiction of a human is in many ways sometimes exaggerated, sometimes, idealistic, intended to look perfect. And so in many, depictions of artwork, we see the human form as perfect, flawless, beautiful, which is probably not true for most people. It's kind of the same way we see fashion and models representing an ideal type of woman, but not really representing most women. And so, ironically, though, if you go back about 25,000 years ago, we have this one particular image of a woman known as Venus of Willendorf. And if you saw her in your book, she's a little tiny statue, about 4.5 inches high, but she represents a kind of fat, overweight, large-breasted woman who was actually painted red, right, to indicate the suggestive nature of the female cycle of Menses, right, and that was to represent fertility. And so to see this healthy, overweight, but healthy, clearly provided for, not in hunger, we see this goddess who represents the ideal of what was important to the people at the time. So, it's only about 4.5 inches tall. 25,000 years ago, it was actually discovered on the banks of the Danube River in Austria, and it was most likely made by hunter-gatherers who lived in the area. The environment at the time was much colder and bleaker than present day, and this would have been someone who was not hungry, right, and well insulated even. So the question is, why were prehistoric humans stimulated by an exaggerated image? I mean, that's kind of the question at the heart of this. But neuroscientists have even speculated that, and contended that this lies kind of in the workings of the human brain and a neurological principle known as peak shift. So the people who made the statue, they lived in this harsh Ice Age environment where features of fatness and fertility would have been highly desirable. In neurological terms, these features amounted to hypernormal stimuli that activated neuron responses in the brain. So, in Paleolithic people terms, the parts that mattered the most had to do with successful reproduction. The breast, the pelvic girdle, right? These parts were isolated and amplified by the artist's brain. In the Neolithic era, which started when the ice covering from the northern hemisphere receded, right? This changed the way of life during the Neolithic era from hunting to agriculture. So the Neolithic era witnessed, even in that shift, an increase in pottery, right? And this is something that's in your book as well, because Before, pottery was too fragile for the hunter, and then so with this change, this receding of the ice, this sort of movement into we can now settle. Now that we're settled in, we can have pottery for practical uses. It would have been impractical for the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers to have pottery, but not for the Neolithic, settling down, more agricultural type people. A little bit about some of the architecture you would have seen in this ancient time. Post and lintel. As humans, we create art, we create imagery, we write on walls, we make gods, and we build structures. So part of the whole concept of civilization is that we all came together, we began to build, we began to have community, society, and in order to be rooted and grounded in one place, to go through the seasons of being able to farm and plant and reap your crops, you have to have somewhere to live. And the most ancient, earliest form of this architectural example that we have would be this post and lintel system. And so the posts, they hold up the lintel across the top, the header, if you will. And that sort of concept is intrinsic. Even to this day, if you were framing a door, right, you would have your header that doesn't rest upon the beams or the door itself, but along the posts that would go around the outside. It's kind of a crude example, but this concept of the weight bearing down upon the posts, being supported structurally by the lintel horizontally across the top, this is an ancient form of architecture. And that would be really the most basic architectural technique for spanning space, period, in the ancient world. So, a little bit now about some other kinds of people, and we'll talk even a little bit about the kind of architectural things they had that weren't post and lintel for spanning space. Your book talks about the Anasazi culture, which now this kind of brings us back over into the United States. What was now the United States was, of course, not then. It was just this continent and belonged to different people. But northeastern Arizona and northwestern New Mexico, southeastern Utah, and southwestern Colorado, you kind of have this point where all four of those states come to an actual corner. And if you're flying over and you're low enough to see the ground, you can actually see where this 4 points come together. And it's actually a marker. You can go there and you can stand, I think, in some way where you're actually in 4 states at the same time or something like that. But anyway, that has nothing to do with what I'm going to tell you. But that's where we would have found the Anasazi. Now, the Anasazi seem to have developed from an earlier culture, the Oshara, which was an archaic culture, small nomadic bands. They lived like in the more mountainous parts of the territory. But the introduction of pottery, probably from the south, signals the beginnings of the culture we call the Anasazi. The people grew corn, beans, and they were also hunters and gatherers. Now, in their villages, as I said before, people come together, they form societies, civilizations, they got to have somewhere to live. So their villages consisted of these small pit house or pueblo groupings. So even the term pueblo means people. It's a assigned title given to them by the Spanish, and even the Anasazi, I think, is like maybe Apache or Navajo. I don't really know exactly which tribe, but it was a kind of a term given to them by another people. We don't know enough about the Anasazi to even know what they called themselves. I guess this is my point here. But they had pit houses, pueblo groupings, usually had a large ceremonial structure known as a kiva. So a variety of burial practices were used. Most often bodies were flexed in shallow pit graves in the refuse heaps surrounding the villages. So the house types of the Anasazi, kind of like the Mongolian, they lived in these pit houses arranged in groups around a larger ceremonial room called a kiva. The kiva may have served some religious function, but more likely its initial function was just a council chamber, kind of like where the elders of the settlement would come together and discuss issues relevant to their survival. And what are we going to do? What do the elders say? The pit houses were constructed of jacal, which is a type of wattle and daub construction. In some areas, surface structures were made of masonry, then surrounded by additional surface dwellings of the wattle and daub. These groupings would lead ultimately to the modern pueblo. Now, the Anasazi, they built their kivas with a small round hole in the floor to represent a belief that their ancestors emerged from the depths of the earth. So even when they would meet together with elders, right, there's a high regard and respect for the ancestors. So even in the kiva, in the council meetings, there was a place for the ancestors to emerge from the depths of the earth, so to speak. In the emergence stories, meaning like where a people came from, usually that means that they came from the ground, the most of the stories. So, we have creation myths, which tell the origins of the world, typically, and the universe, rather. And then you have emergence stories, which will tell the story of where a people came from. So in emergence stories, people once lived underground for various reasons. They embark on this journey that eventually will lead them to emerge into the above ground world. Societies that have emergence tales are able to point out where their ancestors emerged from the underground. So the Pueblo, they had emergence tales as well. The following would have been some of their beliefs concerning in their emergence tales. The forces of nature are inhabited by living spirits. We call this animism. Humans can communicate with natural spirits. This is something common to an emergence tale. Nature's behavior can be compared to human behavior. But one thing that it is not is reflected in the Pueblo emergence tales would be that humans can take on animal form if they offer proper sacrifices. So let's jump back across the hemispheres and to talk a little bit about the Shinto. This is Japanese. So with all the different emergence tales and creation myths, the Shinto have a creation myth as well. And I actually had that as the primary source for this first week, but it seemed like a lot to put on you, so I didn't include it. Anyway, don't worry about it. But it's an interesting thing. Your book talks about it too, and I think it has an excerpt from it, but we were going to read much more of the tale itself. But the essence of Shinto is about devotion. So to the Japanese, it was devotion to invisible spiritual beings and powers called kami. They were devoted to shrines, and they had various rituals. It wasn't really a religion in the sense that it didn't really have much to do with anything but honoring ancestors, spiritual beings. Shinto isn't really a way of explaining the world. What matters are rituals. Rituals that will enable human beings to communicate with the kami. Now, I know you're thinking, so are kami like gods or God? No, they're not. They're just spirits that are concerned with human beings. They appreciate our interest in them and want us to be happy. And if they are treated properly, they will intervene in our lives to bring health benefits, business success, maybe do good on an exam. So Shinto is a very local religion. Most devotees are not concerned with proselytizing it's really, most people have a local shrine, and they're concerned with that one local shrine, rather than like the religion as a whole. So many Japanese will have a tiny shrine altar in their homes. However, it is an unofficial national religion that draws many pilgrims, so to speak, from across the country to visit other shrines. So because ritual rather than belief is at the heart of Shinto, Japanese people don't usually think of it specifically as a religion. It's simply just an aspect of Japanese life. I've only had a little bit of experience in Asian culture. My wife, actually, she lived in Japan for like 8 years, I think. Went to high school in Japan, and she talks. Her parents have told stories. They were actually involved in a church there, and they said that many people who came to their church, they still practiced Shinto, but they were also considered themselves Christians, and so there was some tension there in that area, with some of the principles of Christianity versus the principles of Shinto. And so my father-in-law had talked about how they had many conversations with Japanese Christians who still practiced Shinto. He didn't think that was okay, but anyway, my point is to say it's so much part of their culture. It was very difficult for them to do life any other way. My own personal experience in this kind of realm would have been when I went to Thailand, and in Thailand, I think less than 1% of the population is anything but Thai Buddhist, and every building, house, hotel, grocery store has a shrine. Every shopping center has a shrine, and there's incense burning, and there's flowers and things offered to the Buddhas, and it's not to say the Thai people are Buddhist. I mean, that's an understatement. In a religious sense, it's to say to be Thai is to be Buddhist. So this is a very similar concept. Here, they don't even really think of it as a religion. They think it just simply an aspect of being who they are. And that's the case here with Shinto and the Japanese. So this enables Shinto to coexist happily with Buddhism, which is considered a religion in most of Asia. And it's very much, so you might find someone who is Buddhist and Shinto. Excuse me. The name Shinto comes from the Chinese characters of Shin and Tao. And we'll talk more later on about Taoism. But Tao means the way. Shin means divine being or spirit. So basically, Shinto means the way of the spirits. So shrine visiting and taking part in festivals play a great part in binding local communities together. People make pilgrimages to other shrines. At the New Year, this is important in Japan to go visit a shrine, because Shinto is focused on the land of Japan is clearly an ethnic religion. Therefore, Shinto is not really interested in missionary work. It's not rarely is it practiced outside of the country. Shinto sees human beings as basically good and has no concept of original sin or of humanity as fallen. Everything, including the spiritual, is experienced as part of this world. Shinto has no place for any transcendental other world. Shinto has no canonical scriptures, meaning no Bible, that they would say this is our religious text, like the Jews would say the Torah or the Talmud, and Christians would say the New Testament or the Old Testament, the Bible. Hindus have, the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Those are their religious texts, but Shinto doesn't have like a closed sort of, these are our scriptures. Shinto teaches important ethical principles, but has no commandments, has no founder, has no God. Shinto does not require adherents to follow it as their only religion. The Ise or Ise shrine is also called the Grand Shrine of Ise. ISE. I think I'm saying that right. I've never heard it said in the native dialect, so I don't really know. But the East Shrine is also called the Outer Shrine. It's located near the city of East in Mikin Prefecture, which is in central Honshu, right? You knew that. Anyway, I'm just telling you where it is. But so the large shrine, it's like a complex, actually, and it includes many scores of buildings. The two most important being the inner shrine, Naiku, and the outer shrine, Geku, situated about 4 miles apart. This structure is huge. So the Ish Shrine is a major destination for pilgrims and for tourists and has millions of visitors annually. So the Shinto main sanctuary at Is is always built of wood to demonstrate reverence for the natural world and tradition. Now I want to talk a little bit about Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we see some discussion about the Sumerians. The Sumerians were an ancient people in Sumer, in what we would call Mesopotamia, which is actually Greek for land between the two rivers. So Meso being land, Potamo being river. Mesopotamia is the land between two rivers. So the Sumerians, really important ancient civilization. They had a common language. They believed in the same gods and goddesses. They were polytheistic, so they had belief in more than one god. There were 7 great city-states, which each had their own king and a building called a ziggurat, which is actually a large pyramid-shaped, building with a temple at the top, dedicated to a Sumerian deity. Although the Sumerian city-states had much in common, they fought for control over water, which many say will be the warfare of the future if we continue in the direction we're going. Whether you believe that or not, it's up to you. I don't know that I have a stake in the interest, and probably won't happen in my lifetime, but hopefully my children will have clean water. But they fought over control of the river water, which was a valuable resource. Each city-state needed an army to protect itself from its neighbors. So they had a common language, they had common gods and goddesses, they were polytheistic, right? The city-states looked the same, but they didn't get along with each other. The arts actually developed in the Sumerian city-states as well. They had their own kind of artistic expression, their own art forms. But the art largely was a celebration of the priest-king's powers. So art was developed in the Sumerian city-states largely as celebrations of the priest-king's powers. Visitors to the ziggurat often would leave statues representing themselves to serve as prayer offerings to the gods. Mesopotamians viewed human society as part of a larger society that was governed by the gods. There's a stele of Hammurabi, and this is important ethical code that comes from this time period, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But there is a god, Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun god, is portrayed in an art form on top of the stele of Hammurabi, which shows that he's giving his blessing to Hammurabi, Babylon's ruler. So another really important piece of literature that has come out of this time period in this location in the world is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Mostly the story of Gilgamesh is famous because it has a similar worldwide catastrophic flood story, much like the Bible does, with Noah. So it's famous, or infamous rather, for that relationship. But there's more to the story than just that. The story of Gilgamesh is considered an epic because it actually describes the people's common heritage, so it's important in that. But just to give you a little bit of a summary of Gilgamesh, just kind of give you a breakdown. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk. His father's mortal, but his mother is a goddess. But unfortunately, that's not enough for eternal life. So because he's part mortal, Gilgamesh is going to die eventually. And the story is kind of his discovery and acceptance of this fact. Gilgamesh, he's not a good ruler. He's a bad ruler. He sleeps with women, takes away from children and their families. Not a great guy. His subjects ask the gods for help. They actually create such a clamor that it gets the attention of the gods. And so the gods have the goddess Aruru create a man named Enkidu, who will be almost Gilgamesh's equal. So Enkidu comes to life in the wilderness, covered in hair, shaggy like the wilderness, eats grass with the gazelles, drinks water with the animals. I mean, he's just a real ruffian, right? Then this trapper comes along, sees Enkidu, and is frightened by him. So he asks the trapper asks his father what to do, because Enkidu is freeing animals from the traps. Actually, he's letting them go. His father says, go to Uruk, find Gilgamesh, and tell him about this wild man. Then he should, when you get to Uruk, ask for a harlot from the temple and bring her back with him. This is a great plan, I suppose, they thought. She'll seduce Enkidu, and then the wild animals will reject him, and he can be lured to civilization. So the harlot does exactly that. They find a harlot, bring her on. She seduces Enkidu. He's rejected by the animals. She teaches Enkidu some of the ways of civilization, such as wearing clothes, eating bread, drinking wine. Then she tells him of the strength of Gilgamesh. This doesn't sit too well with Enkidu, because he wants to meet and challenge Gilgamesh to a contest of strength. So it's kind of an alpha male struggle. He's thinking, oh, this guy out there thinks he's all that. Where's he at? Let's do this. Enkidu hears about Gilgamesh and how he's sleeping with all the women of Uruk, and he's shocked by this. And he wants to challenge Gilgamesh to conquer him. He wants to force him to behave morally or properly. He wants to whoop him into doing right. They struggle like equals, but finally Gilgamesh overthrows Enkidu, who loses his anger and recognizes Gilgamesh as a true king. So then they embrace, they bro down. They become best friends. So Gilgamesh longs to perform great deeds so his name will be remembered. He wants to go to the cedar forest and slay its guardian monster, Humbaba. So Enkidu is terrified by this because he knows Humbaba. But Gilgamesh insists and says, hey, let's go, let's do this. They prepare for the journey. Enkidu's hand is paralyzed, actually, though, when he touches the gate to the cedar forest. Gilgamesh helps him continue, even though he has this paralyzed hand. They have these disturbing dreams, but nonetheless, they decide to cut down a cedar tree. So Humbaba approaches. They fight. Humbaba begs for his life. They say no. They chop off his head. Gilgamesh washes himself, puts on clean clothes and his crown. He's so attractive at this point that Ishtar, the goddess of love, wants to marry Gilgamesh. Now he refuses. He's actually kind of rude about it, pointing out how, she's been a trifler all these years. She ruins the lives of her previous husbands. He's like, you got a bad record, Ishtar. No. This hurts her, actually. and she gets mad. And so she goes to her father, Anu, demanding that he send the bull of heaven, a drought, to punish Gilgamesh. She threatens to smash down the gates of the underworld if her father does not comply. So Anu, doesn't want to upset his daughter. Clearly she's pretty intense, so he obliges and sends the bull of heaven. But Enkidu catches the bull by the horns, and Gilgamesh kills it. Unfortunately, though, as Enkidu discovers in a dream, the gods are holding a council to determine who should die for these attacks on the divinity, Gilgamesh or Enkidu. Naturally, since Gilgamesh is part divine and part human, while Enkidu is part human and part animal, the sacrifice, the judgment, falls on Enkidu. He gets sick from this, he dies, first cursing this harlot who led him to civilization and Gilgamesh and death, but then blessing her for the joy of friendship with Gilgamesh, and he's just kind of going through this really awful time. And this upsets Gilgamesh. He's distraught with grief, and he's facing this mortality thing, right, again, and it's weighing on him, and he's kind of in a place of denial. So at first he decides he's going to keep the body of Enkidu for a week until the body actually gets a little wormy, and then he has him buried and wanders out from Uruk into the wilderness as a wild hunter dressed in animal skins. Gilgamesh despairs for the loss of his friend Enkidu, but also despairs for his own death, which he now understands will one day come. This humanity, this life, this death, this certainty of death. Seeking to avoid death, Gilgamesh looks for Utnapishtim, the only human being who is granted eternal life by the gods. He wants to learn the secret of how to avoid death. So eventually Gilgamesh comes to the entry to the land of the gods, which is an other world, which is under a mountain guarded by a man-scorpion and his mate, right? Of course, who else would guard that? So Gilgamesh gains entrance to the mountain and travels for leagues in the dark until he arrives in this jeweled garden of the gods. Gilgamesh continues in his search for Utnapishtim. It's a hard word to name to say. Utnapishtim. And the secrets of life and death is in it he's searching for. He meets this divine winemaker named Siduri, who gives him shelter and advises him to accept his human fate and enjoy life while he's still alive, while he still can. He insists, though, I gotta find Utnapishtim, so she tells him that the boatman, or Shanabi, can take him across the Sea of Death to the place where Utnapishtim lives with his wife. So this is good news for Gilgamesh. So he goes on this boat trip. It's kind of complicated, but he gets to finally to Utnapishtim and tells him the story. He says, here's what happened. So in the story of the flood, this is part of the story of Utnapishtim, who tells the story to Gilgamesh rather than Gilgamesh telling him the story. Sorry. So the story of the flood, which again is remarkably similar to the story of the flood in Genesis. The point is, the flood was a one-time ever event. It's never going to happen again, and the only reason that Utnapishtim and his wife are now immortal is because the gods chose to make them so, because they survived the flood. So the final blow to Gilgamesh here, because he wants to, he's promised he could have eternal life, right? But he's got to sit through this really boring story. Now the story puts him to sleep, and so as Utnapishtim is telling him this story, his wife is baking a loaf of bread for every day that he didn't stay awake for the story. And so the blow here is that here's 7 loaves to show that you have been asleep for 7 days, one loaf being the oldest, being the most moldy, and then being able to see the progression. Somehow it was a way to prove that he'd been asleep. We baked these loaves of bread. Anyway, and so it shows you can't even stay awake for 7 days, to hear a story. How are you going to live forever? So Utnapishtim's wife actually takes pity on Gilgamesh at this point, and she asks her husband to tell him about the plant that can make him young again, if not immortal. So this is good news in the story, right, for Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh dives into the sea to pick the plant, but he actually loses it later while bathing because a snake slithers in and eats it. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk with the boatman Urshanabi and points out to him the mighty walls. This is the proper work of a human being, not the search for eternal life. The final segment of the story tells of the death of Gilgamesh and the mourning for him of all the people of Uruk. So unfortunately, Gilgamesh does not attain eternal life. So when Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill Humbaba the Terrible, the guardian of the cedar forest, they're actually given a little bit of help by Shamash, the sun god. And again, just to recap, it's important that the gods wanted Utnapishtim to have immortality because he survived that great flood. And so, some people say that this story has a lot to do with kind of the story in Genesis. However, I see a parallel, I see a comparison for sure, but I would contend most of these stories are far more fantastical, or fantastic rather, than the kind of stories you read in the book of Genesis. There are miracles, there are these events, but they're typically not as, fantastic, not as mythical sounding. Still there's, some would argue there is a great amount of myth or, fantasy to believing that all the species of the world could fit into a boat and be saved. But many people contend that the parallel is similar in symbol, but different in quality. Qualitatively, there's some difference in the kind of story you find in the two. You decide. In fact, this could be an interesting research project for somebody who's ever interested to explore the similarities or differences, parallels, do a compare and contrast between the Genesis story and the Epic of Gilgamesh. But now that we're on the topic of Genesis, we have to acknowledge that the Hebrews did emerge kind of in the Mesopotamian part of the world. So we got to give them a little bit of discussion here. The Hebrews, they were different from the other systems, the other belief systems, primarily because they were monotheistic. They had belief in one God, Yahweh, Jehovah. So most Near Eastern cultures, they worshipped many gods. So the Hebrews, they weren't like that. They had one God. They had a status, in their opinion, in their tradition, as the chosen people. And this meant that they were to set an example of a higher moral standard. So the Ten Commandments are their moral standard, but the Law of Hammurabi, the document of Hammurabi's code, is another ancient ethical code, and it's extremely useful as a source of discussion for the Mesopotamian government society in the Babylonian time. So the code is written somewhere about 1780 BCE. It's one of the most influential codifications of law in ancient history, the text provides us with concrete examples of the expanding influence of centralized government on the people in their professional lives and the general population as a whole. It also gives us a clear sense of the ways ancient Babylonians invested divine authority in their secular leaders. So how do they differ? How does the Code of Hammurabi differ from the Ten Commandments? Well, the Ten Commandments provides an ethical code where the Hammurabi Code actually just gives a list of punishments. Don't do this, or you'll suffer this consequence. So the Ten Commandments differ from Hammurabi's code in that the Ten Commandments provide an ethical code. In fact, Judaism is dubbed ethical monotheism. Chapter 3 deals with Egypt, ancient Egypt. A little bit about the mythology of ancient Egypt. Egypt mythology was the belief structure and underlying form of ancient Egyptian culture from at least 4000 BCE, which is evidenced by some burial practices and tomb paintings, to 30 Common Era with the death of Cleopatra the Seventh, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt. We're more concerned with beginnings here. Every aspect of life in ancient Egypt was informed by the stories which related to the creation of the world and the sustaining of that world by the gods. Egyptian religious belief influenced other cultures through transmission via trade and became especially widespread after the opening of the Silk Road in 130 BCE, as the Egyptian port city of Alexandria was an important commercial center. So the significance of Egyptian mythology to other cultures was really in its development of the concept of an afterlife, an eternal life after death, belief in benevolent deities, and even reincarnation. Some influences on the Greeks can be found in Pythagoras, Plato. It's believed that they were influenced by Egyptian beliefs in reincarnation, and Roman religious culture even borrowed extensively from Egypt, as did from other civilizations. But, the core and the belief system for the Egyptians primarily revolved around the Nile, the sun, and the seasons. And they had a mythological explanation for all those things. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, or Black Land, due to the annual floods depositing black silt. Every year, the Nile overflows its banks and deposits all of this fertile, actually rich and nutrient-rich silt from the river on the land, and so it actually was an essential part to the farming and the agriculture at the time. But the Egyptian religion, to get back to that, was primarily polytheistic. They believed in many gods. Kind of again to compare them to the Hebrews, who were mono. Mono means one, poly means many. So the Egyptians were primarily polytheistic. Human existence was understood by the Egyptians as only a small segment of this eternal journey that they were on. We're all on this journey, working our way to the other side where we're going to be reincarnated or live or whatever. There was this concept in Egyptian thought that human existence was a small segment of an eternal journey presided over and orchestrated by the supernatural forces in the forms of the many deities and gods which compromised this Egyptian pantheon. So one's earthly life was not simply a prologue to something greater, but it was part of the entire journey. So the afterlife was as important as this life, but both were important. It was all part of a journey, all part of a process. The Egyptian concept of an afterlife was more of a mirrored world of this life. And you needed to live that life well if you hope to enjoy the rest of your eternal journey. So there was a belief that if you were a slave in this life, you're probably going to be a slave in the next life. If you're a farmer in this life, you're going to be a farmer in the next life. And so the next life was always thought of as kind of a mirrored world of your life here on earth. Now the Egyptians had a creation myth as well. Kind of an origins. Where did the universe, cosmos, come from? To the Egyptians, the journey began with the creation of the world and the universe out of darkness and swirling chaos. So once there was nothing but endless dark water without form or purpose, kind of similar to the Genesis creation myth. And then out of this chaos, this is a little different though, Nu rose, the primordial hill. So out of this chaos, which we call Nu, rises this primordial hill known as the Benben, upon which stood the great god Atum. Some versions of the myth would say it was Ptah instead of Atum, but we'll roll with Atum. So Atum looked upon the nothingness and recognized his aloneness, and so he mated with his own shadow to give birth to two children. Shu, which was the god of air, and whom Atum spat out, and Tefnut, which was the goddess of moisture, whom Atum vomited out. Now, if that was a little confusing, it's because it is. So let me say it one more time. So Atum looks at the nothingness and recognized his aloneness. So, the perfect solution to that is to mate with your own shadow, apparently, in this case, and give birth to two children, Shu, which was the god of air, whom he spits out, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, whom Atum vomits out. So Shu gave to the early world the principles of life, which Tefnut contributed the principles of order. Leaving their father on the Benben, they set out to establish the world. In time, Atum became concerned because his children were gone so long, and so he removes his eye and sends it in search of them. So while his eye is gone, Atum sat alone on the hill in the midst of the chaos, and he contemplated eternity. Shu and Tefnut return with the eye of Atum. Later, this concept would be associated with the Ujat eye, or the eye of Ra, or what you might say is the all-seeing eye. Pardon me. So if you look on your dollar bill, and you see the top of the pyramid, and you see the eye shining out of the top of the pyramid, that's where this comes from. So their father, he's grateful that they've returned, shedding these tears of joy, these tears dropping onto the dark, fertile earth of the Benben. And of course, those tears give birth to men and women. So these early creatures, they had nowhere to go. However, Shu and Tefnut, they mate and they give birth to Geb. Good news is Geb's the earth, and Nut is the sky. So they have Shu and Tefnut, who were vomited and spat out of Atum. They give birth to Geb and Nut, which we have earth and sky. Geb and Nut, though brother and sister, fall deeply in love. I mean, of course, the earth and the sky, it's just like a beautiful marriage. Who cares if we're brothers and sisters? I'm kidding. So Geb and Nut fall in love, and they were inseparable, as they are to this day. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Atum found this behavior unacceptable, and he pushed Nut away from Geb, high up into the heavens. The two lovers were forever able to see each other, right, but never able to touch. Nut was already pregnant by Geb, fortunately, which gave birth to Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys and Horus. These are the 5 Egyptian gods most often recognized as the earliest, or at least the most familiar representation of older god figures. So that's Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus. Osiris showed himself, a thoughtful and judicious god, and was given rule of the world by Adam, who then went off to attend to his own affairs. Osiris administrated the world efficiently, co-ruling with his sister/wife. This tends to be common among the gods. His sister wife Isis, and decided where the trees would best grow and the water flow most sweetly. He created the land of Egypt in perfection, with the Nile River providing for the needs of the people. Now Horus, sometimes known as Horus the Younger, to differentiate from Horus the brother of Osiris, was raised in secret to protect him from Set, and having grown to manhood, challenged his uncle for the rule of his father's former kingdom. So the battle raged for 80 years until Horus defeated Set and banished him from Egypt to dwell in the arid deserts. Though there are many variants of the story, in some, Horus and Set agree to divide the kingdom, and others, Set is destroyed. Either way, Horus then ruled with his mother Isis and aunt Nephthys as his counselors, and harmony was again restored in the land. So the Egyptians believed that a good deity like Osiris required a bad deity like Seth, because opposites were necessary for balance, harmony, and cycles. You have to have the good, you have to have the bad. You got to have the balance. It's the yin and the yang in Taoism. It's the, it's the light and the darkness, right, in Star Warsology. Sorry. So everything in the universe was thought to be maintained in this constant balance, without a terminus, without an end. And human beings are part of this universe. They too participated in this eternal balance. There is no end. This life is part of the journey, the eternal journey that we're all on, right? But there is a balance, and that's key to this Egyptian thought. In the palette of Narmer, Narmer is portrayed wearing a different crown on each side of the palette to symbolize the unification of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And so you had 2 parts of the kingdom. So when we look at the artwork in this from the ancient Egyptians, it's typically associated with gods and the afterlife, or the other life, I guess, or the rest of life. Typically well preserved, right? So when you see the pyramids, most of the surviving Egyptian art and architecture that we have today to see is associated with burial and the afterlife. So we also have some evidence of the honoring of the pharaohs, and this is important because again, representation here, like how humans represent themselves, emerges even in Egyptian culture. And so you see the gods being idealized, the pharaohs being idealized. I mean, not the gods, but the pharaohs. So Egyptian sculptures, they would have these idealized pharaohs. The anatomy in their sculptures was perfect, to convey like this notion that their perfection mirrored that of the perfection of the gods. We see kind of this whole concept flipped on its head, though, with Akhenaten, who breaks away from the polytheism of his day, decides to move the kingdom to a place where he can see, where he sees the sun in the sky, and decides that this sun is the sun god and the only god to be worshipped, and moves from polytheism to monotheism. And Akhenaten was also deformed. There are many speculations as to why. Who knows? Some think that it may be kind of a genetic disorder that he had, that passed along generationally. But the sculptures we see of Akhenaten are deformed, and his family deformed. So scholars think that it's because he was, and that he broke from this idealizing of the human body and moved into this, realism of the human body. And as the Pharaoh, we see him not perfect. So this is different for that. But, most Egyptian sculptures, they idealize the pharaohs to reflect the gods. Akhenaten, he rejects the gods and turns to one god. Anyway, so very interesting, and it's in your book. So there was a change, though. Since we look at a lot of the burial artifacts and sculptures and artwork, and we find in one example the Middle Kingdom developing these royal funerary sculptures where the arms came to be crossed in a mummy-like pose. And so this would have been something that would have made sense to the Middle Kingdom. So you had the upper, middle, and lower. You got Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, and you got the Middle Kingdom. So both Narmer in the Palette of Narmer and Sinwarset, led by Atum to Amum, Re, display a bull's tail. So one last final comment on Akhenaten. His god, I don't know if I told you, but it was Aten. That was the god that he declared to be supreme. So in breaking away from his polytheistic past to a monotheistic religion, Aten, the sun god, was his supreme and only god to be worshipped.